We will be starting in 1 minute. Yeah.
All right, hello and welcome everyone to this second session of the Include annual conference, which will be about merging perspectives on decent employment for Africa's youth in the post-pandemic context. My name is Mariolke Oosterom. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, the University of Sussex, where I lead the research portfolio in youth employment and politics. I mainly work on the politics of informal economies and youth participation and peace and security myself. And having collaborated with Include on a number of occasions over the past few years, it's my pleasure to chair the session today. And Chamaka Nwachuku will be your facilitator. I hope many of you have been able to join yesterday. And if you are in a place that's very sunny today, we're even more appreciative of you rejoining us today in the second session. Now, we have seen from the audience that you are as diverse as the speakers in the session today. We have researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. And this is exactly the interaction between research policy and practice that we hope will move forward the debate on decent jobs for youth. So by now, it's very clear that the costs and the long-term legacy of the pandemic will be largely falling on the shoulders of the younger generations, and economic recovery and job creation especially, and decent jobs all the more, will be a key priority. So in this session, each speaker will present the opportunities and challenges for decent job creation for youth from their perspective. And this is really intended as a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and we hope that you will be bringing in your expertise, whether you're in research, in policy, or practice, because it's the merging of perspective here that's really deliberate in the title. You're also very welcome to bring in your expertise from original angles. Like, we're talking about decent jobs and jobs creation. In many countries, we know we cannot see job creation as separate from the wider political economy, how political power is organized. And if we listen carefully to the voices of informal youth movements across Africa, then we know that they do not just want the jobs, they want to have the voices in the debate about job creation, about a stake and about a role in decision-making. And overall, a voice in building back better, this wider debate. So please do share us all your original ideas from different angles. And I'm going to explain to you the different ways in which you can do that today. As you can see in the program, we will have 4 rounds of discussions, and you have the opportunity to take part in the discussion in each round using the live comments and questions by raising hand, or using the Slido, which is an interactive board that you will be able to access. Let me talk you through some of the housekeeping rules, and I'm sure you're very much used to them by now after all the long time of working from home in many places. We ask you to mute yourself to limit background noise, and please don't interrupt the flow of the speakers. The session is live streamed on YouTube, so if you don't want to be seen on some of the screenshots that will be taken, you please turn off your camera. And for the audience especially, you have the chance to participate in various ways. On your screen, you will be seeing a link to Slido. Slido is the interactive board. We'll use this for polls, and you can post questions and vote on each other's comments and questions. So kindly go to that link, and you can also use your phone for that and enter the access code to join the session's interactive board. And you can do that now. You can see in the chat that there is a link and the access code posted. Please use that for each of the 4 rounds. During the Q&A session, if you want to speak, please use the Zoom function to raise your hand and wait for the moderator to give you the floor. So please feel welcome to interact. This is really meant to bring different actors and stakeholders together, as each have their own strengths, but we can only move forward if there's actual conversation between them. So without further ado, I will be handing over to Chiamaka. Chiamaka will be introducing each of the speakers, and we will keep a keen eye on timekeeping so everyone will have equal chances to participate. And I will be with you in the final wrap-up of this session. Chiamaka, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marioke, and thank you to the entire Include team that has had me to be a part of this conversation. I am excited to be here, and the list of panelists and people who will be discussing on this important issue today is diverse, exciting, and very impactful, and I'm glad to be here. By way of introduction, my name is Chiamaka Nwachukwu, and I am the coordinator of the African Youth Charter Hustlers. This is an African Union program to engage youth leaders from all the 55 AU member states to advocate for the Youth Charter, which is the guiding document for youth advocacy and policy issues on the continent. I'm a young person, as you can obviously tell, and this is going to be as interactive as possible, and we're going to be discussing a very important topic on merging perspectives on decent youth employment in Africa's youth post-pandemic. With me today are important guests from different areas and different sectors who will be speaking on various issues surrounding this particular topic. And the first I have here is Drew Gardiner. Drew Gardiner is from ILO, and he's a youth employment specialist. He will be speaking to us today. And then the next on my list is Dr. Cheik Dieye. He's the executive director at the African Center for Trade, Integration, and Development. And he's going to be speaking from a perspective of policy, strategy, and action on the continent. And then we have Tijmen Roosboom. He's the Dutch ambassador for youth, education, and work at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he will be speaking on policy, strategy, and action in the Netherlands. And then finally, we have Shona Bezanson. She's the head of the Eastern and Southern Africa Perspective at Mastercard Foundation. So as you can see, we have a lot of important perspectives, and they're varying, and we have people here who are going to be able to give us important information on this topic. So we'll get right to it. As Marioke had mentioned, we will be interacting on Slido, and the first poll would go live and right now on Slido. And basically, we want to know, what are the biggest challenges in your experience as young people, as youth leaders, as policy researchers in decent youth employment and creation? So what are the biggest challenges that you have been able to identify? So while that poll goes live, I would start with Drew to give us a perspective from ILO's work with multilateral policies and discussions concerning youth employment. So Drew, thank you. I'd like you to take the stage now, and let's have a conversation. What do you think are the biggest challenges that you have noticed from your discussions and policy and research with youth employment, especially on the continent Africa?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very excited to have a conversation with you, Chamak, and the other panel members. Maybe I'll just start it off brief, and thanks again for inviting ILO to participate in this session. Indeed, things have been challenging for the past year and a half for young people in particular. and to also a large extent, young women, have really bared the brunt of the global really jobs crisis since the beginning of the pandemic. We came out with some figures recently, Chaimaka. So the latest is that 500 million jobs have been lost during the pandemic. 525 million. So this is almost the size of the U.S. That jobs have been lost since the crisis. So it's huge. And our analysis shows that it's been largely young people that have suffered. We've done some analysis around that. If you're interested in finding out more, we came out last week with a statistical update on the youth employment crisis during the pandemic, which I'd be happy to share with the participants. To be a bit more precise, maybe I see the challenge circling around three areas, and this has to do with the recovery and how young people in particular should be targeted and should be a part of the recovery going forward. We really have an opportunity now, I think, and this has been a big challenge, is to create policies that are employment friendly, especially macroeconomic policies, but also structural policies, to influence in a job friendly way more the pattern of growth as we go forward. And there's an opportunity to do that now with all of the resilience and recovery measures that are being put in place. Secondly, it's not only about the quantity of jobs, but the quality of those jobs. We know that in many low-income countries, there's just an absolute lack, of job creation. So there's not a lot of jobs for these young people to go out there and get. But that conversation can't happen without talking about the quality of those jobs. Jobs need to be more formal. They need to have higher wages. There need to be more respect for young people's rights at work. Now more than ever, we see that we need policies where workers are able to combine in a more intricate way their work and private lives. And social protection. That has been a huge issue during the pandemic, as appropriate social protection measures will allow us to not repeat some of the failures that we have seen during this pandemic. And third challenge I want to mention quickly is one of measurement. We're all measuring job creation and job indicators in different ways. And I think there's a big opportunity and also a challenge for more collaboration and coordination on how jobs are measured. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'll leave it there.
Interesting. Thank you, Drew. Do you mind clarifying your point on measurement? So when you say it needs to be clearer how jobs are measured, can you give an example of what you mean in this case?
Yeah. We should. Let's go around the table and ask every panelist what is the definition of a job, and I'm sure we'll find a different answer from everybody. So and it's normal. There is different definitions for this, but a lot more sharing, I think, and coordination on this would go a lot better in order for us to have evidence for what works when we're looking at at policy solutions.
Thank you very much. And you raised important points, especially about how it's important that economic policies being put into place now need to actually be focused on job creation. So if we're going to be looking at building forward better, and we're looking at what are the priorities for policy making and discussions, we need to be looking at things that actually employ people. And you also mentioned something about jobs being more formal. I'm going to circle back to you in the next round to ask you to please clarify on that point, because I think you made a really important point. But I would also like to see what you think about the informal sector, because in Africa, it's a very big part of of our employment.
90% of youth jobs. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
90% of youth jobs.
Exactly, are from the informal sector. So we're going to come back to that conversation, in talking about, the opportunities of transitioning from that kind of statistics into, what you talked about as ideal. So now I would go on to Dr. Dieye Chik. He is going to be speaking to us from the African perspective. So Dr. Dieye, you also work with young people. I see that you also teach at several universities, as well as the work that you do in trade and policy on the continent. So I would like to know what in your experience, with as many practical examples as you can give, are the major challenges with youth employment on the continent?
Thank you very much, Shamaka. As I said, I'm very pleased to join this discussion. And indeed, it is important to have this kind of conversation, in particular in this context of COVID, as it is evident now that it has restructured the economies, and we should also take lessons and to learn something from it. As you said, the situation in Africa, even before COVID, we all know that the economic growth in the continent was not inclusive and rapid enough to absorb the growing labor force in the formal sector. And it is like this COVID came just to reveal what was the situation, which was can be explained by the fact that most of the political economies or the policies that was elaborated and applied in Africa was not really enough appropriate or good to solve this matter of employment. And this is because of the fact that the production and consumption patterns in Africa were not really adapted to the conditions and the requirements for sustainable development that were seen in Africa. That is why even if there are huge opportunities for Africa to create jobs, to make real the structural transformation or industrialization, in many or most of the countries, we did not succeed to have these done or happen. And we have many examples that we can give, because the problem in Africa is that the most of the sectors, when you come to the transforming or processing commodities, raw materials, and so on, most of these sectors are not really receiving the investment, the necessary investment, or if it is a case, in many cases, they are also in the hand of global companies, the big companies, the firms, instead of being controlled by the small and medium-sized companies, which are the main or the most important part in this. Just take the example in the agriculture sector. Do you know that the larger rubber plantation in the world is in Liberia for rubber sector or value chains? But in this country, you would see that very little. There are only 6,000 workers in this sector. Very low job, very bad job. And you can see how is important these value chains in the international era of this rubber. You can also take another example of these policies that are not very good enough. Burkina Faso is one of the biggest producer of cotton, 472,000 tons in 2020, but no job in this sector, no company transforming or processing cotton. And of course, Burkina Faso, the youth people in Burkina Faso are not also taking opportunities or finding jobs in this sector. You can take many other examples, even in Senegal, which is my country, Guinea-Bissau. I was working in a project of research on the raw cashew nuts in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. We have seen that these two countries are producing 1,075,000 tons of raw cashew nuts, but the African countries also, youth are not getting job in this sector. This is the problem of how the economy is framed, producing raw material and commodity exporting, but not really working or having policies that would strengthen and improve industrialization, creating companies and putting Africa in the regional and global value chains.
Interesting points, Dr. Chik, and thank you for that. And you mentioned, something important that you further elaborated. And one thing you mentioned was that the conditions were not very adaptable to deal with the changing situation. So the policies that we had in place have been relatively static for a certain amount of time. And I also want to know if you think that maybe this has something to do with the educational systems. Is there any tie-in between our educational systems in this context and the kind of policies that we're seeing and the kind of youth unemployment patterns that we're seeing? Do you think that there's any tie-in or any challenge to be explored in that area?
Yes, of course. The problem is that the education system is not really putting in the national market the labor force that is needed by training them. One of the weakness of most of the African countries is to put a clear link on, but before that, knowing what are the real demands and needs of the production sector, and also putting in the education sector the good and appropriate programs that could train youth and also people to be able to go to this working sector, because that's why you have this informal sector, which is very, very huge. The few companies that are here are in many times looking for workers that are trained or in some technical sectors, but that is not the case. Most of the universities are in literature, philosophy, law, and so on. And what is needed for engineers, for very good trained people to be able to support efforts for structural transformation is most of the countries not there. So there is clearly a link between the education sector, which is not really framed to be able to support the policies for industrialization. So lack of perhaps not all, part financing, but also accessing to technology and many other things that are also some constraints.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chik. And now I would want us to see what our audience has to say about this. And in the last poll that we just put up, the majority say that the biggest challenge in their experience in decent youth employment creation is insufficient private sector demand for labor. The next most frequent option that was chosen was a mismatch between the education and job market requirements. So Dr. Chik mentioned that, so that's important. Then the next was inaccessible financial service, and the fewest number of people felt that informality was the biggest challenge. So that is important to think about in our conversation. So I would like to go on now to Timon from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm certain that in the work that you do with Youth at Heart, you have a lot of engagements on youth-centered policies between like bilateral engagements with other countries. And then I would like to know from your experience, what has been the biggest challenge in creation of decent youth employment, especially in Africa?
Thank you, Chimaka. And hello, everyone. It's real great to be in this panel with a very diverse view and different experts. So thanks a lot for that and for organizing it to include. So yeah, well, the biggest challenges, I think, first, when I started writing what the audience just said, I noticed that I was more or less clustering the challenges in a bit of the same order. Although it is, of course, something very difficult to say this is the biggest challenge. I also think that it is I really hope that we soon go into some of these opportunities and some of the, I know we are, because I think to start with summing up all the challenges is perhaps a bit depressing, but very important to do. But first of all, I would say indeed insufficient demand, as in the way there's just not enough decent jobs around, which is, I would say, the problem number one. And I think connected to that big challenge is, of course, the issues of underemployment and informality, informal jobs. So I would say that this is the first cluster of challenges. Indeed, mismatch is something very important as well. The skills component. So in our strategy, which I will probably in the second, when we come to the solutions, I'll tell a bit more about our Youth at Heart strategy. But that's also very much focused on the one hand, jobs, and on the other hand, skills, and making sure that there is indeed, at least in our programming, which focuses on Africa and the Middle East, there is a match between the jobs that are out there, and that is important, that young people need to create themselves, and the skills. So when we talk about skills, this is we're talking about digital skills, of course, because the issue of digital, the opportunities that gives are, of course, very big. Entrepreneurial skills, as I just mentioned, these 21st century skills, right? These higher order cognitive skills, they're very important to make sure that actually young people are actually ready to join the market in the 21st century, and the flexibility that needs, and the learning how to learn is almost more important, one of the most important skills. So I think also, as Sheikh said, important things about the way the system, education system, is not geared towards the market. Maybe this was more from a university point of view, but this can also be true for example, TVET education, so technical education. So I would say the third, apart from skills, of course, connected to this is also, for example, challenges of internships. Nowadays, especially with the pandemic, we see that is even a bigger problem than it already was. It's also something, by the way, all of these challenges were really well written down by ILO, and Drew already said that as a sort of a wake-up call in the beginning of the pandemic, to see all of these challenges that we're facing young people now. But I think the third cluster of challenges would be, which I also notice, especially when talking to young people, is that the systems, and therefore perhaps sometimes also our programs, are not necessarily geared towards young people. So we actually cannot do something working on improving the economy or the private sector development and assume that it will automatically create jobs for young people. We really need to put in that extra effort. We really need to make sure that our analysis is correct, and that we work on the enabling environment and the policy environment so that it actually benefits young people and creates jobs for young people. So that means involve young people. And if you'll just allow me to say two more specific challenges, perhaps outside of these bigger clusters, so to say, is on the one hand, access to internet. I think we all saw that the last year. This is, of course, huge. If more education and more work is actually going online, then we really need to put in an extra effort in this regard, not to see inequality growing. And the specific challenges that young women face, because they often are the ones, well, it's very often for young people, last in, first out. That's what we saw during the pandemic as well, and during other crises. And I think mostly for young women, both to make sure you get the right skills, and then to find and be able to keep a job is even more challenging. So that deserves our attention as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Taiman. I would now move on to Shona. Shona, you work with the Mastercard Foundation, and there's a lot of discussions right now about, there's the poor quality of economic growth, highly challenging business environment in Africa, and then, all of these issues facing young people, especially in getting decent employment in the private sector, and also the mention of the mismatch between education and then the type of jobs that are available. So I would like you to shed some light on that, especially with the work that you have done. I know Mastercard Foundation funds a lot of projects, especially in education. So I'd like to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, Chiamaka, and it's great to be here with everyone today. We've got lots of sunshine here in Kigali, so for anyone who needs some, I'm sending some your way. So absolutely, what the other panelists have said today really resonates, that there's just simply not enough work for young people, that the work that exists is informal in nature. Absolutely. But I think what is really worrying, and what we hear consistently from employers and those private sector employers, for example, that you referenced, is that even when the jobs exist, young people are coming out of education systems underprepared for that work. So I'm going to focus there. So we know that secondary education is the platform from which the majority of young people in Africa will be entering the labor market. Secondary education is becoming more and more accessible, but the challenge is that secondary education is not putting a premium on the skills that help young people to be adaptable, resilient, creative problem solvers, which is really what the world of work needs. They're not coming out with those entrepreneurship skills, those digital skills that Timon also mentioned. And so there really does need to be a shift in terms of secondary education, moving it from an elite system for a select few to a system that is open to all young people, that provides the skills and competencies that young people need to thrive in a rapidly changing world of work. And then we think about post-secondary education, and fundamentally, a challenge is access. We know that only 8% of young people in Africa go on to post-secondary education. That really needs to shift, and only 1% of displaced youth in Africa are attaining higher education. So these are really, really low indicators that do need to shift. And we know that cost is the major barrier. So I think we need to think really creatively about how do we reduce the price point of post-secondary education while safeguarding excellence and ensuring inclusion. So that's a challenge that we're thinking a lot about these days. Certainly what Sheikh said around curriculum and pedagogy and the mismatch and the disconnect with the labor market is a very real challenge in terms both of the technical skills, so thinking about those value chains, where is work all along those value chains, whether it's cashew nuts, an ag value chain, digital, really need to zero in on where are the work opportunities for young people and adjust the content that's being delivered at post-secondary education institutions and the pedagogy, the way in which content is delivered, so that young people are coming out of universities better prepared with an entrepreneurial mindset, with transferable skills, as well as the technical competencies and the knowledge to be successful in the world of work. I think Timon also referenced, e-learning has been a major challenge over the last year and some. And at the outset of the pandemic, we surveyed our university partners in the Scholars Program, and the Scholars Program is made up of 25 universities around the world. 12 of them are in Africa. And what we found was really an unevenness in terms of preparedness and capability, and with the big public universities in Africa in particular. And those are the universities that serve the most students, that typically serve the students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. They were the least prepared, and they struggled the most to pivot to online learning. And the challenges that we heard in terms of that pivot to online learning, one was electricity. I mean, basic infrastructure, both at the university, but also for students as well as faculty who went back home to remote communities. Devices and connectivity is another challenge, and the last mile in particular. Data is expensive. Students who only have mobile phones, this issue of infrastructure related to connectivity really does need to be addressed also to ensure that no one is left behind when we have to shift during these crisis modes to online learning. Content is another challenge. It's not fit for purpose, content that was quickly digitized, put online, but not really designed for adult learning pedagogy for most effectiveness. So a lot to do in terms of content development. And then capacity in terms of instructional design and pedagogy, in terms of teaching methods. And this really does require also a mindset shift on the part of the universities, instructors, faculty members who really have told us teaching can only happen in a classroom. How can we teach via Zoom? It's just not possible. But that's a mindset shift that needs to continue to change for universities as well as for students and parents. And what we saw is that the most disadvantaged young people are the ones who drop off. Young women who have lots of demands on their time, young people with disabilities who just don't have the accommodations and assistive devices, for example, to continue learning in a crisis period. So I'd like to focus my remarks on those challenges. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Shona. And we have made a lot of important points, but I would like now to move away from challenges because we can have like a whole 2 hours of conversation on where all the gaps are. But we need to focus on opportunities because we are building forward, and we need to look at where are the opportunities and not recommendations now. Recommendations will come much later, but what are the areas that we're not that we can expand on? So there's a lot of conversation about the digital economy, right? And a lot of conversation about how the solutions are in technology and digitizing different things on the continent. But some young people also say that things like transport are important, things like being able to move from one place to another. What are the opportunities in education? What are the opportunities in empowering young women? These are the things that, I would like us to spend some time talking about. So first of all, we'll have our second poll, and it's what are the biggest opportunities in your experience for decent youth employment? So that's on the Slido. Please let's see your answers. And then I'd like to start with Dr. Cheek. To talk to us about what the biggest opportunities are in his experience for decent youth employment, especially on the continent. Dr. Cheek?
Okay, thank you very much for this. If you allow me, because I have just seen a question coming from the participants, or perhaps you want us to respond to those questions after, depending on how.
Yes,
because yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Come, please.
We can do that at the end, but if there's a question that relates to this particular topic, we can.
Right. Yeah. I think there are the opportunities, as I said earlier. Most of the people thinking of the Africa's economy, the opportunities could see that the sector of processing or value chains on the agri-food sector is one of the huge or the most important sector in Africa, and investing on this sector through these small and medium-sized companies for processing and for processing for the African market in particular, because I think also the creating regional value chains at the starting point for African companies is something very important, because as I said, coming to the global value chains would be something very complex in some areas, but on the regional value chains, starting by the agro-industrial sector would be something very important. And if you look at Africa, what is now being done through the African Continental Free Trade Area is one of the tools or objective to make that happen. By opening the African market and by removing most of the trade barriers, it would give them an opportunity to companies or small-scale companies and so on to be able to process products and to sell in the African market. But that also means that we need to change some policies in national level, but also in regional level where now most of the African policies.
Yeah. Okay, I think we might have lost Dr. Cheek for a bit.
Talk about agri-food sector, you can bring in most of the other things by, like, e-commerce would be supported also by this sector. All the things related to digital, also the health industry and so on would be also strengthened or reinforced by this work or investment in the value chains, regional value chains on agri-food.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cheek, for that important information. And you know, talking about the AFCTA, it's important to also, you know, highlight financial institutions, especially led by young people on the continent, that have found a way to make payments easier. Because, you know, we're talking about the free trade agreement, the free trade area, and we're looking at how it would be helpful to have a block of trade that removes all the trade barriers on the continent. And that is one way to ensure that young people are able to improve their engagement in decent employment through engaging in private sectors who now have a larger market, more income, more revenue to be able to employ more people, and on it goes. So that's important to note. Agriculture is an important component of that. I'd like to go on to Drew. Drew, you mentioned we had a small conversation about the informal sector, and I think that I would like you to maybe shed some light on how the bulk of young people are involved in informal sector, and not just informal sector employment, informal sector without social protections currently. So what are the opportunities that provides for us to transition from those kind of employment into more formal employment that affords them more protection, more job security, more general, you know, security. So yeah, I would just like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, good question. I wouldn't have all the answers, maybe just a start on them. Yeah, as I said, it's pretty much all young people, young workers, well, in Africa in any case, are in the informal sector. And the informal sector is inherently indecent, if I can say it like that, precarious. But not all jobs in the informal sector are indecent. There's also good jobs. I mean, it's not one or the other. And indeed, I think, you know, a lot of governments are setting up specific mechanisms and measures in order to support the informal economy. So already, I think it's a good sign that now there's some acceptance that the informal economy does exist and that we can provide support mechanisms for this economy. Other governments aren't there at all. Actually, some governments won't even use informal. Informal means illegal in the end, you know. So there's a challenge there in the end. Yeah, I think social, you know, we need to innovate a bit with our social protection mechanisms, so that there's new forms of social protection that can provide services to more, you know, harder to reach, marginalized populations. Those don't only need to be provided by government, they can also be provided by more non-traditional types of organizations like cooperatives, associations, workers' organizations, and you know, frankly, also different actors in the digital economy, and that's one I would also speak about as well, and not to go past it, because I think we all have this, or there's a bit this narrative coming out that you know, digital training and job solutions will help us a bit leapfrog the problem of the informal sector, right? Because if you work online, you don't necessarily have to be registered as a worker. You don't have to be enrolled in social protection schemes. You know, lots of groups that might not be able to have to receive work permits, like, you know, refugees or other displaced populations, may also be able to have incomes through these digital platforms. So there is a lot of promise there. There is a lot of promise there, but the limitations far outweigh the hype for the time being. I mean, there's a huge digital divide still. There's connectivity issues, there's access issues, and there's a lot of decent work issues as well. We're starting now, and Dialogue came out with a report in February, the World Economic and Social Outlook, which was focused on the gig economy. Super interesting report, providing a lot of meat for how to create effective policies in the digital economy and with the gig economy. By the way, Jamaica, during COVID, the digital labor platforms increased by 5 times. So there's 5 times as many digital labor platforms today as there was at the beginning or just before the pandemic. So it's with us now to stay.
Yeah.
Yes. To stay. The estimate from the report says that 33% of workers in the world have already got jobs through digital labor platforms. A third of workers. So it will be an area of increasing employment opportunities in the future, and we have an opportunity now before it explodes, and it already has exploded, but it's particularly in middle and low income countries to set policies to create good jobs, online. So I think that's a big policy priority for us, and it really should be for everybody, not only in the job space, but in the training space as well. And, we have some movement on that. In Sweden, they now have a policy on the gig economy. California tried, it was unfortunately repealed. South Africa is working towards policies on the gig economy. And this is young people in the end, because people are much better set up to work in this sector than older populations. So I would see that as a big area of opportunity, but one fraught with challenges as well, Jamaica.
Thank you, Drew, for those important points. And you made mention about how this is the future, but like you rightly said, there are several limitations to that at the moment, because the barriers that created the digital divide in the first place are the same barriers that are also preventing people from accessing decent jobs. So the barriers are the same across board, and it will be great for us to, while we understand that we are going more towards a digital economy and there's a lot of opportunity there, what are the things that we can also capitalize on, or the things that we can also explore in the current situation, or in the current circumstance that many young people on the continent find themselves in. So Shona, you had a very detailed description of what you felt the challenges were, especially with the education system and how it doesn't translate directly to what the job market needs. So what do you think are the opportunities here? What are the areas that, are not thought about or not talked about enough for us to be able to improve these conditions, especially for young people?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about secondary education and the reimagining that's necessary to make it more flexible, to meet young people where they are, to recognize that young people don't pass through secondary education in a linear kind of fashion. I think that we have found that often it really boils down to teachers. And there's an economic sector. The workforce around education is a major opportunity. But how can we incentivize young people to go into that profession? Right now, young people see it as the profession of last resort. I failed, I didn't get into engineering, I didn't get into medical school, I guess I'll go and be a teacher. So how can we professionalize, how can we incentivize and celebrate teachers, and really make sure that we're attracting the best and the brightest into the teaching profession, and then thinking more broadly about the workforce around teachers. So, is it teaching assistants? Is it, young people who can work with kids who have different learning abilities? So there's a lot, I think, in terms of the economic opportunity around the education sector. Likewise, we haven't spoken about this as much, but Sheikh mentioned it. I think, the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the need for much more investment in health as an economic sector. So think about the work opportunities for young people across that value chain of health, whether it's about, community health workers, the whole workforce around hospitals and community health centers, deploying vaccines in Africa is a massive undertaking. Everything from the supply chain, transportation, the policy environment that so many people have mentioned, all of this requires skilled young people who can engage at different points in those value chains. And I think there's a lot of economic opportunity and a lot of work opportunity along that health value chain also. Expanding vaccine manufacturing in Africa, this is something we're really excited about. The foundation just announced yesterday that we are deploying $1.3 billion in partnership with the Africa CDC to really save lives and livelihoods in Africa, and really strengthening the capability around vaccine manufacturing is a focus of that. So thinking about the human capital, the talent development, the research and design that we'll need to really strengthen around that. So all of those are economic opportunities and work opportunities for young people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shona. And what I'm hearing is that on the continent, we need to move from, we need to move to a more people-driven economy. We need to move to economic policies that capitalize on the human resources on the continent, of which the bulk, are young people. Young people make up the majority of the continent. So it's important that we start to look at those human resources as probably the most important resource that we have on the continent. And you spoke about education, and I'd like to pose this question to Timon. In some conversations with young people, the educational systems, we've talked about teachers, we've talked about how we need to improve these education sectors, but what do you think is the tie-in from education into actual real life skills? For example, in terms of internships. So there are internships that exist for young people. How do you think that these kind of partnerships, or partnerships between the private sector, the employers of labor, or the people who will use these skills, how can they partner better to make sure that young people are more prepared for these jobs, and not just prepared, empowered for these jobs in terms of financial empowerment, resources that they need, and all of that. So I just want to know what your thoughts are on that, as well as you were going to mention what you have been doing at the Youth at Heart program. So let's hear that from you. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Chiamaka. Well, yeah, I can go into this issue of course, of the skills, the life skills, or at least the skills that can, on the one hand, make sure that young people are able to find a job, but that's not the only reason, right? Where you have education, you also have education to be a citizen in your society, and to be empowered in that field as well. It's just always important to highlight that. But yes, I think in cooperation with the private sector is very important in that regard. And in our programs, when we're talking about matching jobs and skills, we try to highlight that as well. Really involve the private sector in the programs, as we try to do. Taking an example sometimes from the Netherlands as well, where really, especially at for example, the TVET education, there is a lot of focus on working with the local private sector to make sure that actually that what the youngsters learn is immediately adaptable to the work reality of the companies that are around them. They are actually involved in working on the curriculum. They are very much involved in internship. It's like working and learning at the same time. So we really see that there is opportunities there as well. But still in the Netherlands, it's also a constant struggle to make sure that actually the skills that young people learn also at university are gearing them also towards a job in the private sector. I've very often encountered people, and I think one of the speakers before also mentioned, who are really feeling that, for example, a university job is something that would also prepare you for a government job, for example. While this is very often not the place where you will be able to find the most jobs. So that is also something that you can improve by working on a curriculum that is more adapted to the reality of the market. But that's about the skills, because if you look at the opportunity, this is of course one of the biggest opportunities. If we want to make use of this youthful population that we see, the youthful demographic that we see everywhere, want it to be a dividend, we indeed need to invest in upskilling, so to say. On the other hand, also looking at possibilities, I think some sectors were already mentioned. I think this is important. For example, the green economy, the digital economy, indeed, or outsourcing of services. This is also something that we hear more and more when talking about the future of work, the type of, right, as it's called, the sectors, the industries without chimneys, that are in the end going to be the ones that are going to create the jobs. This is something that could also be, for a lot of African countries, could be a huge potential. But indeed, definitely also agriculture. Agriculture now is very often not attractive to young people. Also, when I lived in Kenya, I always noticed that I lived there for 7 years, and I always noticed that for a lot of people, agriculture was something that your grandparents did, and not something that you could be proud of to be doing yourself. Well, and you see that a lot of the farmers in the corporations and the organized are quite old. If you would actually make agriculture more attractive in a way, making more use of some of these things that we just said, the opportunities of green economy, of digital, that would really be an interesting sector as well, a growth sector, because majority of young people, as already mentioned, live in rural areas. So that is an opportunity. Entrepreneurship, let's say, upscaling these SMEs, right? That is often where you get the jobs. Moving a company from 3 employees to 10 or 20 employees is very often the way how jobs are created. Connecting to markets, and Mr. Sheikh already said so much about this, the regional market specifically, of course, this is crucial. But allow me to highlight again that during the pandemic, what we saw, all this innovation, Drew also mentioned it, the amount of companies that went online, that really immediately adapted their way of working and actually became, for example, an online grocery store, or something that was really adapted to the new reality that we saw. And I see it's more and more often in these conversations I have with young people as well, is more and more being recognized. I hope, Chamaka, that you also feel that way, because I feel that it's more and more being recognized by a lot of governments, also private sector, that we need to cooperate and need to work with young people, because there is no way that we're going to get any of these opportunities when it's not adapted to the lived experience of young people, when it's not adapted to their reality. So this is the biggest opportunity if we are all, governments, private sector, NGOs, multilaterals, more and more working towards gearing our work, specifically adapting them specifically to the challenges and opportunities of young people. That would potentially be the biggest opportunity around.
Thank you so much, Hyman. And I'm so happy you mentioned that, because if you didn't say it, I was going to say it, that it's not possible to have youth-centered policies without youth at the table. I mean, there's a lot of research and, thorough work and scientific method going into finding out what the problems are, but the young people need to be involved in that process, need to be co-creators of whatever policy that is going to come out, because it directly affects them. And it's important to note that young people are not going to just be end users of these policies. If they're not involved in the entire process, it's not likely that the solutions being preferred would be able to address the major issues that they face. So that's really important. So what does our audience think are the biggest opportunities? Private sector growth is the most important to the audience. And the next is startups and small to medium enterprises. I'm assuming that means support for SMEs. And then we have institution and financial support. So those are the 3 top opportunities that young people participating in this conference at the moment think that we should be looking at. And you know, that's important. Like you mentioned, Timon mentioned agriculture. But if we're moving agriculture from, you know, subsistence farming that has to do with a lot of effort and very little outcome, and then we're looking at how to improve that to be big employers of labor, then we can probably have a lot more human resources and a lot more young people looking at employment in this area, which will directly also improve the economies of this country, of these countries. So thank you, that's important. We'll now move on to our last point of discussion, and I'll pose that to the audience. Is on the slide. What are the major recommendations? In your opinion, what should be the major recommendation going forward? And for our panelists, I'd like you to please, when speaking about your recommendations, I would like you to make it as practical as possible. We want to know as much as possible if there's any work being done in this particular area already by your organization or by you. And two, we would like to know how you have included young people in the creation process up until this point, or if you haven't, how you plan to include young people in the recommendations that you think are important for the creation of decent jobs on the continent. So I will start with Shona.
Sure. My recommendation, Chiamaka, was going to be my very first one. I think we've all, been reading each other's mind, is keeping young people at the center of everything that we do. And I think that requires, in many ways, a mindset shift. It requires a lot of humility. It requires listening. It requires mental preparedness to be challenged and to think differently about the solutions. And so really being intentional about engaging young people, and the way in which the MasterCard Foundation has always and continues to do that is consulting with young people. Our Young Africa Work strategy was really a direct result of broad consultation with young people, as well as governments and other stakeholders across the continent. We have youth advisory committees in all of our countries of focus. We have youth councils that we engage with. We require all of our partners to go through co-creation processes that include young people and youth voices as we co-create our partnerships. And so I think there's lots more that we can do. We're not very good about, when we do research, circling back to young people, circling back to communities with findings and insights. So there's certainly other ways that we can stretch ourselves in terms of ensuring that young people really are front and center, but it certainly is in our minds with everything we do. And the other point that I think relates is about being really intentional about inclusion and really, thinking about who's at the table, who's not at the table, whose voice is being heard. How do we go out and seek to consult and engage with young women, with young people with disabilities, refugees and displaced youth, rural youth, really ensuring that we are not thinking about young people as a homogenous entity, but that we are really intentional about engaging with young people who are more marginalized and face higher barriers in terms of attaining dignified and fulfilling work, decent work, and really ensuring that we're listening and co-creating solutions together with them. And I think that's an important role that we as a funder can play, is creating those spaces, demanding those spaces for ourselves, but also for all of our partners.
Thank you. And Shona, to circle back, it's I like the fact that you have given very elaborate information on how the MasterCard Foundation has involved young people in the process. So there's the issue of exclusivity sometimes, where the same opportunities are being recycled around the same young people all the time. And how are you certain that the information being brought is actually representative of what young people think? So I want to know if you have any thoughts on that, especially while we're talking about recommendations going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we find it ourselves, the usual suspects who are spotlighted in our publications, who are put on the platform to speak on behalf of, the interventions, the projects that they've been part of. So, I think it has, for us, required One, knowing who the young people are that we're working with. And so, creating channels and opportunities for the foundation to engage directly with young people. One very concrete way is we've set up alumni chapters in a number of the countries where we work, and we work directly with those alumni chapters. And those alumni chapters are made up of young people who have passed through a variety of projects and partnerships that have been supported by the MasterCard Foundation. And we make sure that those young people, that we're snowballing, through those young people, that we're featuring different kinds of young leaders in different kinds of sectors, making change in different ways, whether it's through policy engagement, whether it's through their MSMEs, whether it's through the work that they do at community level. So just celebrating different kinds of how young people exercise leadership in different ways and in different spaces. But it takes intentionality, it takes, and it takes reminding ourselves and checking ourselves on our team. Have we done enough? Are we reaching deeply enough? Why are we featuring this young person? I've heard them before. Who else is out there that we can put the spotlight on so that they can shine and they can have that experience, also build their own profile, their platform, and create opportunities for themselves.
Thank you so much, Shona. I would now move on to Dr. Cheik, and my question to you, in line with the recommendations that you have listed out, I would like a lot of young people, especially in the comments, are asking questions about the AFCTA and how we can strengthen the economic policies for small to medium enterprises and trade that is being directly led by young people. How can we strengthen and make the economy more favorable for young people to engage in business, for young people to be employed in the private sector, and also for young people to be employers of labor in the private sector?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the most important thing to say on this area is that here, even in Africa as the continent, taking into account the information we have and the work we have done there, but also in the regional level, we can say that most of the demands from young people is very, very clear and coherent in their own situation, because they are mostly asking for, first of all, being able, as somebody said it, to be able to participate in the policy elaboration process or policy making process. We talked about the IFCFTA, which is a very important thing that can, if it is very well done and implemented, will be able to transform a bit the intra-regional trade in Africa. They are asking for being able to have their voice, to say also how they see the thing. But by asking for that, the young people, in my view, they are seeing that we should take the opportunity of this COVID for changing 3 or 4 things. The first is changing the objectives in the continent when it comes to the economy or how we frame the economic policies. Changing the objective is not only putting the focus or investing on some short terms or system or sectors which would be based only on pure free trade, but they're asking for investing in sectors where they will be able to produce, to be involved, and to have the opportunities also to become an actor, not only following the others, but becoming an actor, which needs, I think, from their perspective, to change the objective of the policies. In order also, as I said earlier, to invest on some concrete things. I talked about agro-food value chains, the medical industry, and so on, because they are seeing that these sectors would be some sectors that will be good for wealth creation, but also giving them the opportunity to be able to become actors and to make sure that their voices would be also understood. The second that should be changed is on the methods of working. I can give an example here from Senegal. On this process of COVID recovery, the Senegalese government put in the table huge amount of money for supporting the young people in the country by investing in some sectors, but also giving them directly money for their own project. It was not done through a long process of discussions with the young people to be able to understand really what they want, what are their real needs. It is like the government come just because they was angry against the government because of the sector, the COVID, and there are a lot of problems they are raising, and just to give them the money in order to stop the contestation and so on. And I think the thing that should be done here is to be able to really know what they need to do, what they want to do, where they want to go, to understand their views and so on. And lastly, it is to see what should be now the priorities. The new priorities, I think, should come from first the education of these young people. When you come here in Dakar, or it can be in Nigeria or in Cote d'Ivoire, in all the countries in Africa, even in the developing countries, the huge problem, one of the biggest one, is the lack of education. And where there is education, it is not adapted to the economy or really the production sector. The second is what kind of measure, real and concrete and adapted measure, can we also see to accompany the young people to help them understood. Because just also another example, if you see here in Senegal, but also some other countries, the most active people in these startup creation, this digital economy and so on, are the young people in most of our countries. And this is a new thing that can help also giving them the voice, strengthening and reinforcing real and concrete sector where they have some opportunities and value added and so on. They will become, I think, actors when they come together by coming with some organization they can put in place in order to influence also policies in the right direction, which is focusing on what I call the human economy, not only speculative or financial system and so on, but human economy, which will be on agri-food, which will feed people. Because for me, it is not understandable in Africa to be able to invest in good big highways or prestigious infrastructures where your people is not eating very well. It is not also understandable to not being able to when there are problems of these diseases, the medical system is also something very, 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 very bad. So these also water, sanitation, and so on, I think what I call the human economy should become the focus one, and young people should be in the base of these sectors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheik. And now I'll move on to Drew. To talk about the recommendations, and drawing from some of the questions I've seen being sent in the comments. So we want young people want to know, what are your thoughts on social protection, especially for companies that are they're not direct employers of labor. So for example, ride sharing services, accommodation sharing services, and things like that. How do we, because if we're moving to a more digital economy, those issues on how social protection laws would work in that kind of context become very important to talk about. So I'd like to know what your recommendations are, and then maybe if you can shed some light on this question as well.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, yeah, it's super question. Thanks whoever asked that one. But the issue is goes beyond that, actually, Jamaica. So there, for the time being, the platform companies do not consider the users of those platforms, similar to Facebook or Twitter or whatever, as employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's no employment relationship
mm-hmm.
between the companies and the people using those services.
Yeah.
So by nature, there's no requirement of those platform companies to provide any type of protection.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is, this is not sustainable. This needs to change, and it's starting to change. Now, if that can change and we can go back to an employee-employer relationship, at that point we can start discussing different models of social protection. And there's some very good examples. We're starting to refer to them as like social impact platforms, that have some type of social business model behind them. There's a lot of talk these days about, how do I put it, kind of socializing the platform economy, or making it more of a public good than it is now. Similar to like Obamacare, for example, where you bring a sector which is traditionally privatized to being more public and run by a public service. That's a bit of an extreme view. There won't be any, very few governments and no platform companies agreeing with me on that. But what's also being discussed now is portable benefits, portable social protection benefits. So it doesn't matter who your employer is, your benefits are not tied to that employer, but the employer is still required to contribute to those benefits, but you can take them from one job to the next. It sounds simple, but it's not being done. So I think that's one, and there's a number of different kind of models of social protection that we can discuss and could be applied to these models, but we're not dealing with the basic issues and the basic challenges yet for the time being. A really good example of this is, well, we know a lot more about the business models of the platforms now, and it's really based on finding cheap labor and informal labor. Unfortunately. I was looking at Upwork is huge in Africa, which is it's like a kind of a freelancing platform. 65% of Upwork's profits last year came from commissions they charge to the worker themselves. I mean, it's crazy. So I think we need to go back to investigating a bit how employment relationships are created, and then we can start talking about a bit, these protection models. Yeah. Sorry to get excited there.
Thank you for that. And you raise an important point about portable social protection rights, and I think that is a big recommendation, a big opportunity that we need to start talking about some more, because it does seem like, as much as we're saying we want the private sector to grow and be strengthened, it does seem like a lot of the conversations around private sector and how they hire is to find the cheapest possible labor for the best possible results. I know that that's the thinking, but at the end of the day, we do need to protect the young people who are going to be part of this labor. So that's important to note. So I'll end with Timon to talk about some of the recommendations, especially what is already in place. And there's a question for you, Timon, basically on you spoke about agriculture, and then how we can also look at recommendations to improving interest and the engagement of young people in sectors that are rewarding but are not necessarily very utilized at this moment.
Thank you, Chamaka. Well, on recommendations, allow me just to say a few things about what we're actually already doing and what we're currently implementing based upon the insights that we had. First of all, I mean, we within our program, we are really trying to, as I said, integrate jobs and skills. So we got, oh, I'm sorry, my phone fell down, the joys of the digital working. So on the one hand, that is, for example, the Challenge Fund, for example, Challenge Fund for Youth Employment, that's really trying to work with the private sector, local private sector, to try to create jobs and improve jobs together with young people. And and with with, for example, civil society organization, Knowledge Institute, but mostly with private sector. So these are programs that are actually already trying to implement some of those recommendations, so to say. The same as, for example, our Orange Corners program, which is more on entrepreneurship, and that really also tries to focus more on the one hand on the mentoring and on the whole incubation, but also definitely on access to finance increasingly, trying to have this integrated approach, trying to tackle some of these challenges at the same time, jobs and skills, focusing on the promising sectors, as you just mentioned. I will go into that in a bit, because I will also highlight again the importance, as you said, of the voice of young people, that we try to do that through our Youth at Heart virtual forum. And that is something that you can actually still check online on YouTube, like this session is also being recorded. So that is always good to afterwards you have some more time to look it up, because there we actually try to have that, like we're having now, this conversation between policymakers, but really with a lot more young people there, trying to discuss what the opportunities are and trying to come up with some solutions. It was really interesting to do. Indeed, it is difficult to move beyond the usual suspects, so to say. It is always a big challenge to try to make sure, especially now with the digital day and age, it is actually even more challenging, although it also gives you the opportunity to talk more directly with young people. We would not have, into a real life conference, I would never have been able to fly in 800 young people for a discussion from all over the world, but digitally you can. So we're also trying to integrate some of those recommendations that they gave to us, as young people gave to us in our work, also through an advisory committee and a toolkit on meaningful youth participation and a youth advisory committee. These are some of the ways we try to work on these recommendations. On these sectors, yes, well, how to make it more attractive. I think this is something that a lot of people working in the agricultural sector are focusing on. But essentially, of course, it needs to be something that is profitable. That is profitable, first and foremost, that you actually can make a decent living out of it. A lot of the challenges are, of course, with the small plots of land. Sometimes the challenge is that like I said, being able to access finance or being able to actually make a living out of agriculture. If it's more connected to the bigger value chains, if it's more rewarding, and if it's actually, that means it also needs to be more geared towards young people. Like I said, I always found it striking to see how little was done to make those sectors more geared towards young people, and how much they were still focused towards the power structures that exist. The big corporations, the big organizations as they are not necessarily the ones benefiting the jobs for young people. So you can make it more attractive. Again, well, it's going to be repetitive by asking young people what they would need, and they will tell you what they need. They will tell you what type of innovations, what it would make attractive for them. And I guess first and foremost, it is something that is profitable. You don't want to struggle like your grandparents did, as I just said. That this is just a sector where you can just get by, just subsistence way of living. That is, of course, not attractive. Well, I see the time is running out, so I'll just stop there. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I love the chat, by the way. It's really nice to see a really active chat, and I try to go through it all and get back to people.
Thank you so much, Hyman, and thank you to all our panelists. I have learned a lot of things here, and I'll just wrap up this session by talking about the results of our last poll. So as we all agree, and the audience agrees, that the most important way forward is to co-create policies that encourage meaningful youthful participation in policy making. And the second is labor regulations and job protection. And the third on the list is accessibility and affordability of financial services. Thank you, everyone, for an interesting panel. Thank you to Include. And I would now hand over this conversation to the chair, Marioke, to wrap up the session.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Emeka, and well done on to all panelists. A lot of this resonated with the wider research, I think, done by Include scholars and also other colleagues of mine, I wanted to cluster some of my thoughts around 3 E's about education, economic growth, and enhancing participation. But then actually Sheikh gave a much better synopsis of this discussion when he said the human economy. And I think that's quite a shift in thinking in if we're moving from like thinking about an economy that mainly is driven for profits, but one that that is a human economy with youth at heart. And I think clearly there are some simultaneous trajectories that are needed, that are the investments in education, the entire infrastructure, but also the quality of teaching, and that teaching is valued, a valuable profession in itself, in economic growth, but one that promotes job creation, not just drives profits, and the simultaneous process of enhancing participation of young people in the diverse policies that support education and job-rich growth. About policies then, in the beginning of this conversation, there was some talk about African policies that need to improve, but clearly there is a way to win when we talk about the interregional trade arrangements. But let's not forget that there's some trade policies between Europe and Africa in which the European actors are in the driving seat that has some inequalities embedded in them, and there's the European corporations that have their contracts that have some injustices in them. So there's not, when we talk about improving policies, it's not just the policies that are created by African governments. We in Europe and the US, there's still an important role to play. There was a lot of talk about education, and I was interested to see the poll that participation was ranked #1 and skills and training was ranked #5. And should we have had this conversation like 5 years ago, I think it would have been the opposite. And that represents a shift in thinking that skills were going to be the big solution to youth unemployment, to now tackling youth unemployment by looking at the structural causes of unemployment and of structures of economies, while the skills and training need to follow the developments of the economy. And I think that's really interesting. And I do think that's a way forward, as there's been a lot of evidence that just skill training is not going to create the jobs. In fact, there is an overskilling in the youth population, especially of the best skilled young people find that their skills are not used enough. And in particular, their digital skills are not used enough. So it means that that's still where the jobs are simply not there. And I really liked how agriculture was mentioned time and again, as that is a sector for growth, that has the potential for growth, that will absorb large numbers of young people definitely in the next decades with growing population. The importance of food to feed this population, but the infrastructure of food, of transport, the possibilities of agricultural transformation, and that will absorb large number of young people that do not have completed secondary education. We published a book last week on the importance of agriculture and how young people indeed do still want to farm, as long as it is not the hard labor that their grandparents did. Like Timon said, they're still very much wanting to farm, as long as there is indeed profitable and if it's like run like a professional business. And I do think we've heard that from so many countries that there is an expectation and desire on the part of young people to be invested in. And the second opportunity that came out various times was the internet and the digital jobs, the digital economy. Both and of course that needs the infrastructure for which we need governments, donors, but of course the private sector very much. That it looks like that is necessary for the jobs for the future, but also the education of the now and the future. So the infrastructure for the internet that is going to be needed to be speed up. It was talked, you mentioned the digital divide. I mean, we need to look at both the possibilities of inclusion, the people that can now be included doing digital jobs, as well as the digital divide and the new possibilities of exclusion of the more remote population. So that's definitely a discussion that needs to be at the forefront in the digital jobs as a theme. What stood out to me also quite strongly is the need for country-specific approaches. That I also looking at the questions that were posted by the audience. Which value chains are going to be generating the jobs is going to be a very country-specific question, sometimes regional questions. What Shona said about following the entire value chain and then determine which training and needs skills are needed there. And it's very clear that the governments are the ones responsible for good quality education, but possibly donors, international development partners can sometimes with their programs be more agile and following the developments in the value chains and develop more flexible and responsive education and skills training. So I really liked what Timon said, already working with corporate actors locally to design locally appropriate TVET and training packages that then map onto the existing growing value chains. A final word then about youth participation. I'm really glad that that came out so strongly from the various speakers. And definitely, I think when we're looking at the architecture of international development actors and partners, there's a lot of progress that was made by modes of working, methods of working that integrate young people and their voices from the entire project cycle, from the start all the way to the M&E, to the evaluation. And Timon and Shona talked about this. We see also the Danish government, for example, starting to do this. So it's happening at the policy level, at the international donor, international development partner level, and most certainly in international non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. I think there's still, if we look at all the stakeholders at country level, there's still some ways that we can make progress, because when we look at country level young youth participation, where and if it happens, it's usually ministries of youth and sports talking about sports or perhaps youth funds, which are still very restricted, limited in scope. So if we agree that agriculture is important, then youth participation with the links to the Ministry of Agriculture is going to be important, with the Ministry of Trade. That's not yet where we see youth participation to happening. And also in the whole discussion about the informal economy, I think youth voices are going to be important because here I sense that sometimes the informal economy was seen as quite negative. Well, I think there's also a lot to learn from the informal economy. And in particular, because not all informal jobs are illegal, many informal vendors pay fees, they contribute as taxpayers in a way. There are informal apprenticeships that are very long-term in West Africa, for example, that are more valued than some of the short-term TVET interventions that development partners deliver. And some of the formal jobs that are believed to be promising, like in the agro-processing firms, are highly precarious. We're doing some research with young women working in agro-processing firms in East Africa. They can be fired the next day. There's no social protection, and there's a high level of exposure to sexual harassment in the workspace. So we need to as long as there is the reality of informal work that is so large, the question of decent, we need to discuss it in both the informal and formal jobs. So there we are. Let's finish on this note of the human economy, which quoting Sheikh, because I think that's a really nice way of summing up the very important discussion we've had today on decent jobs for youth. I want to thank everyone, all the speakers, for their contribution, Include for organizing this very important session, and Shamaka for doing a wonderful job at facilitating. we hope we can still keep adding to the Slido for the questions and comments, and that the discussion can continue. Thanks, everybody, and I wish you a nice rest of the afternoon. And I look forward to the other sessions for the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chamaka. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.